Great. So before we get started today, I wanted to take just a moment and draw your attention to an announcement that went out this morning. So our second midterm is coming up next week, and with the weirdness that this semester has had with us sort of being in person and then online and then back in person again, I figured I'd break it down kind of the same way I did the first one. So we're going to be having the exam in this room during our normal class time on Monday, so a week today. So it's still going to be 50 minutes, starting at 3 o'clock, ending at 3:50. If you finish early, then you can leave early. It's going to be the same basic format as the original midterm, or the first midterm, I guess, just on paper. So I'm going to have only 35 multiple choice questions this time. Still 5 short answer questions, but I find when things are on paper, I like to give people just that little bit more breathing room. And then they're going to be the same basic setup as the multiple choice and short answers that you saw on the first one. It's going to be on chapters 4, 5, and 6. So basically everything that we've covered since that first midterm. And it's going to cover everything up until Friday. My intention is that between today and tomorrow, we should finish up sort of operant conditioning and then the social learning. So we should be pretty much done new content by Friday. So then Friday, we can do a little bit of a review of operant conditioning when I talk about operant conditioning in black-capped chickadees, as well as maybe have some time for questions if you have any on Friday. The intent is to have you learn as little new content as possible on Friday, just so that you have as much time with the stuff before the midterm as possible. And then the last thing was with open book, because the first time around, open book was for the online test. How does it apply in person? So because not everyone is going to have access to a laptop, and it's just easier to not have to monitor what's on those, we're going to stick with anything that you can have a hard copy of. So if you have your notes or your textbook, anything on paper, that is fine. No electronic devices. Now, I would like to note that if you have, say, all of your notes in a digital format, I wouldn't focus too much on trying to print them all out or get everything into a hard copy. I'd instead use your efforts to try and put together like a 1 or 2 page cheat sheet. So take all the important concepts, all the stuff that you really want to make sure that you remember and have access to, and put it together in one place. I find that A, that's a fantastic study method because you focus in on what's important and you put it in as clear of terms as possible. And B, you only then have to look at that 1 or 2 sheets instead of having to rifle through all of your notes and or all of the textbook. If you want to have a full binder of notes with, say, stickies showing you where each chapter is, that's perfectly fine. I just find that these sort of 1 or 2 page cheat sheets are very, very effective. So that might be sufficient. So just some thoughts on the idea. But all of this info is up on Moodle. You would have gotten an email with it as well, so you have access to this. I just wanted to walk through it because it has been a weird semester and I want us all on the same page for this. So that is there. Yeah, I think that was it for that. Okay. There we go. All right, so on that note, we get to start our new type of learning today. So we're going to talk about instrumental or operant conditioning. So when we started our topic of learning, we had 4 different sort of broad categories of learning. We started with our stimulus alone learning. That was habituation, or event alone. So that's when we had a single stimulus, a single event, and we learned something or adjusted our behavior according to that event occurring over and over again. Then we went into our classical or Pavlovian conditioning. We did event learning, where we learned an association between 2 stimuli. And now we're into behavior event learning, where we're going to have some kind of behavior or action or response, and then an event or a stimulus, some kind of outcome or consequence that follows that behavior. And again, this will make more sense as we walk through sort of our definition of operant conditioning and so on, but just another way to sort of frame this. So with our official definition, we can say that operant conditioning is learning that's controlled by the consequences of an organism's behavior. And most of the time when we talk about operant conditioning, we're going to talk about a stimulus, a response, and an outcome. And we actually have other terms that we will use sort of interchangeably with these three. If you go on and study sort of higher level learning courses, we would look at stimulus response outcome relations. You would just call them SRO, and you can kind of break them down a lot more than that. We're going to stick with our straight line because that's a lot more the level that we need for this class. But we're going to be hopping back and forth with this slide so we can talk about our stimulus, our response, and our outcome, specifically as they apply to our law of effect. So we're starting off with Edward Thorndike, and you might remember his name because we mentioned him as one of our behaviorists, those who sort of prescribe to that behavioral perspective, where they emphasize the environmental control of our behavior through the process of learning. Basically, that the environment would be the major player in what behaviors we did because we learned by interacting with our environment. And so Thorndike's law of effect stated specifically that if a response in the presence of a stimulus is followed by a satisfying state of affairs, the bond between stimulus and response will be strengthened. So if we go back to this diagram here, we're saying that, okay, so there's a particular stimulus, there's a particular situation in which this is going to occur. If we make a particular response or do a particular behavior and it leads to a satisfying outcome, the consequence is something good, then we're going to be more likely to do that response, to perform that behavior again the next time we face that same stimulus or situation. So if we are in the kitchen with our mother and it's a little bit messy and they're tidying up the dishes and we wipe down the counter and she thanks us and gives us a bag of cookies, that would be a very satisfying outcome. And maybe the next time we're in the kitchen, we might be more likely to help wipe down the counter because maybe we'll get cookies again. Who knows? So by getting that good outcome, that satisfying state of affairs, we're then more likely to do that behavior when we're in that situation again. So we can also talk about this as stamping in an association between a particular stimulus and a particular response or behavior. So we have a good thing come out of it, so we're more likely to link those two together conceptually. But we can also have the opposite of this. Thorndike goes on and talks about how if the outcome or if the sort of following state of affairs is dissatisfying or uncomfortable, then we're going to go in the opposite direction. So if our outcome is bad, then we're going to be less likely to do that behavior again in that particular situation. So we could say that we are stamping out that association. We're making it less likely to occur again in the future. And a great example of this is swearing in front of your parents. So our stimulus would be having your parents present. The behavior is swearing, and the outcome, if your parents were anything like mine, would be a sound scolding. So that is a bad outcome, so I would be much less likely to repeat that behavior in their presence or when that stimulus is present. So we would stamp out that association and be much less likely to do that in the future. So this idea of doing more of the things that get us good outcomes and doing less of the things that get us bad outcomes actually came from Thorndike's work with puzzle boxes. And so we have an example of a puzzle box on the screen there. So Thorndike would place hungry cats in these boxes that he had designed with very complicated escape routes. And because the cats had to perform fairly complex actions in order to escape, he called them puzzles. They had to work out the correct series of actions that would allow them out of the box. And because they were hungry, he had added motivation to get them to leave the box as quickly as possible. He would place food or milk outside to encourage them to want to leave the box sooner. And then the idea would be that if they escaped from the box, then they're met with this good situation where they're out and they have food or milk. So it's a good thing. So it would lead them to want to escape faster and perhaps perform those actions that led them to escape faster. And I will note that if you are intrigued by this concept of puzzle boxes and the process of it, there's this neat little YouTube video that I like to link with this idea. And it actually shows sort of like a mock-up of Thorndike doing this research and showing a cat in a puzzle box and all of that. So I include that there for your interest. But when Thorndike was originally doing this, he was actually trying to differentiate between two possible outcomes. And so I'm going to hop back and forth again between two slides. So this diagram here actually illustrates the two possibilities. So as per usual, we have our time measurement on the x-axis. So here they're using successive trials, basically how many times the cat was put in a puzzle box and given the chance to escape. And then our y-axis is time to solution, or how long did it take the cat to escape the box. Higher on that axis means they spent more time in the box. Lower on the axis means they escaped very quickly. So the idea would be that they should eventually escape fairly quickly. But what method did they use to solve this problem? The original idea at the time that was really popular was the concept of insight, where you would have sort of an aha moment, where it would occur to you the best way to solve a problem. And this sort of theoretical data that we would see in the case of insight would be our line with triangles. So at the very, very top, we would have the cats taking a long time. They would either not figure it out and have to be rescued, or they just take a very, very long time eventually. And then all of a sudden, there's that aha moment. There's that moment of insight about halfway through where they suddenly know the answer. They suddenly figure it out, and from that point onward, they can escape very, very quickly because they now know the solution. They figured it out. They had some moment of insight. So that's what we would expect if we had insight as the solution, or insight as their method of solution. We might also call that non-incremental improvement because they go from no solution to the full solution with nothing in between. What Thorndike was more thinking was going on is what we could call incremental improvement, or trial and error. And this would work much better with his theory of what is it again? The law of effect. There we go. Always have trouble remembering that one for whatever reason. So his idea for this would be that circle line, where at the beginning they take a very long time, but gradually they would figure out which actions tended to lead to them escaping from the box. And they would be more likely to perform those actions that allowed them to escape, eventually performing them very, very quickly and very, very often because they're associated with getting out of the box and getting access to food. So by his law of effect, they should keep happening. And so we'd see a gradual process where they'd improve slowly or incrementally as they figured out what the right solution was through trial and error. And that's a lot closer to what we actually ended up observing, which is why the law of effect is what's in place now. And if we look at this diagram here, it's the same basic chart, time on the bottom and time to escape on the y-axis, but it's a little bit messier because it's real data. So you can see that there was a lot of variation. Some trials took a very, very long time, some not that much at all. But if we look at the overall pattern, at the beginning, the cats would take a relatively long time to solve the problem, and as time went on, they took less and less time to solve that problem overall, or on average. So if we smoothed that out and took the average, average, we would have sort of a nice slope coming down. Not as extreme as the theoretical data, but real life data never really matches. So that was okay, so it's probably not insight, it's probably trial and error, and so they're learning from the outcome of their behaviors. So the actions that get them out, they're going to do those more, and the actions that don't get them out, they're going to do those less. They're learning in steps. All right, and so at this point, because Thorndike was using sort of these boxes with different controls in them, so he had pedals and levers and pulleys and all of these things, at this point the field was only called instrumental learning or instrumental conditioning because the cats were manipulating instruments in order to escape. So that stuck around for quite a while, but when we move on to our next person, when we start talking about Skinner, Skinner was talking about the operant process. So he went above and beyond just being able to manipulate individual instruments and applied it to sort of a much broader scale. So this is when we introduce the alternative name of operant conditioning. So both are technically correct. This is just why the two different names exist. But we might recognize Skinner because he was another behaviorist, but specifically he was a radical behaviorist. So he wholeheartedly believed that the environment was the only thing that influenced our behavior. So he completely disregarded the involvement of cognition and the mind. He thought that absolutely everything came from what we learned by interacting with our environment. He figured he could explain any human behavior through operant conditioning, which is quite the dramatic claim to make. But Skinner is very famous in this field because his work identified a lot of key processes that take place during operant conditioning. And most of his discoveries came about because he created what's called a Skinner box or an operant chamber. And you'll see these terms used fairly interchangeably. I typically use operant chamber or even operant box just from familiarity. Either are acceptable. But in this situation, he basically set up a small controlled environment where we could monitor what an animal was doing and how they were reacting under very highly controlled situations. So this is how we could pick apart exactly what was going on at each stage in this learning process. So we have an example of a Skinner box or an operant chamber on the screen here. And so these are going to be different depending on what species you work with. You can have, so this one is set up for a rat. They'd be fairly similar for a mouse, just smaller. You typically see a lot of them with pigeons. We just have to consider what they are capable of doing. So pigeons would peck. Rats can push levers, pigeons not so much. So pigeons would have a pecking point. Chickadees, their beaks aren't great at pecking, so we can't have them peck. Instead, we have them hop to a perch. So slight differences in the responses that are produced or in the operants that they do, those particular behaviors, but same basic setup here. And so within these boxes, you would have access to food and water. Water is usually given free access. Food is usually controlled. So with food, it would be delivered usually as a reinforcer, which we'll talk about in just a couple of slides. But when you do a particular behavior, it's really easy to give food as a reward for having done that behavior. So usually food would be used as their encouragement or motivation to do something. So that would be very closely controlled and monitored. We'd also have access to some kind of recording device. And this is where it got really important because if we think about Thorndike and his cats in puzzle boxes, he would sit there and time watching each individual cat escape from each individual device that he had designed. So it was a very time-consuming process where he could run one cat at a time. But with these Skinner boxes, you could set up a whole room full of these. You don't have to monitor it directly because it's going to self-monitor using that recording device. Maybe it's going to record each time that the lever is pushed, or each time that food is dispensed, or both. You can set it up to do both. And nowadays, they're a lot more complex. Instead of just a lever and some buttons or lights on the inside, we can have things like touch screens and entire computers running each box, which I can show a little bit more of on Friday. But this is the base setup that lets us start picking stuff apart. But before I get too far ahead of myself, I wanted to introduce some additional terms. And so these are going to go along with and kind of be, say, synonyms for our original stimulus response outcome. And so I have this on the slide here where we could call our stimulus an antecedent. Our response could also be a behavior, and our outcome might also be a consequence. I'm introducing these additional terms because these were Skinner's preferred terms, but they have the same meaning, and you'll probably have already found that I use them fairly interchangeably because they all kind of fit together really nicely. But for our technical definitions, we can call an antecedent something detectable in the environment that sets the occasion for us to respond. So when we were talking about our parents being present, that could influence whether we want to swear or not while we're talking. So our parents' presence could be an antecedent. It could be a stimulus or an event, something that we are aware of before we choose to make that behavior or not. The behavior or the response is simply the activity that we do, something that can be repeated, that can be measured, and has an impact on the environment. So most of the time, our behaviors or responses are going to be things like pushing levers, pecking buttons, pressing keys, things like that. We can look at sort of more complex behaviors, but the learning literature sticks to operant boxes, at least for the basics. And then our consequences are our outcomes, stimuli that can increase or decrease the probability of future behavior. So we can do things more or less based on the outcome or the consequence that comes from it. And we'll talk about different kinds of consequences in just a few slides. But first, I want to talk about sort of a subcategory of consequences. And this is the idea of differential consequences. And we're going to see the term differential used a couple of times throughout operant conditioning. And it really just means that we have different setups. So we can talk about differential consequences, we can talk about differential reinforcement, all sorts of things can be differential. And it's just a fancy way of saying that they're different depending on the setup. So with our differential consequences, we can have a situation where our antecedent is an experimenter who says, "Give me the file." They're working with a child and they make a request. The child's behavior would be to pick up the file. That's the correct response to that request. And as a consequence, the child would receive a potato chip. The next time, the experimenter would prompt them by saying, "Okay, give me a clip." And the child's response is to pick up a clip. And now we have a slightly different consequence. They don't get a chip this time, now they get a cookie. By having those two different consequences, by having differential consequences, we have specific sort of antecedent behavior consequence setups, and we can treat them separately. We can have them as sort of isolated units, and that actually makes them a lot easier to learn. In our bottom example, same basic setup asking for two different things, but in both cases, even if the child does the behavior right, they're always going to be getting the same outcome, the same consequence. They'll always be getting raisins. So whether they're asked for a nail or a socket, as long as they do it right, they get some good outcome, but it's the same good outcome. So that would be non-differential consequences. And this makes it actually harder to learn because there's overlap between those two series of events because they have the same outcome, they have the same consequence. So it sort of muddies the water and makes it a little bit harder to learn them distinctly because they're almost treated as a unit. Whereas the ones on top have those two different outcomes, and it just makes it that much easier to learn. So we see faster, more accurate learning when we have differential consequences than when we have non-differential consequences. All right, so next we're going to talk about some of those consequences and the types of consequences that we can have. And so this category is called reinforcement contingencies. And so what a contingency is sort of like an if-then logic rule. So if you've ever done computer programming or anything that involves logic, then you probably know what if-then rules are. If not, that's fine. This is when we state that if you do this particular behavior or action, then that particular outcome will occur. We're setting up the rules of what happens when particular things occur. So we're saying if this, then that. So those are our contingencies, and we have a couple of different categories that we're going to look at here for these contingencies. First off, we're going to look at reinforcement versus punishment. So this is our first axis of interest. And I want to make note here that we have a preconceived notion about reinforcement and punishment just because of the way that the English language works. So when we talk about reinforcement, we typically think about rewards, things that we are given that sort of make us feel good. And when we think of punishment, we usually think of bad things that happen. But it's not necessarily that way. So I want you to kind of separate yourself from that preconceived idea of what these are. And we're going to focus on the learning literature definition of these two. So when we talk about reinforcement as it relates to learning, we're talking about any outcome that occurs or any consequence that occurs that strengthens the probability of a response. Something that happens that makes us more likely to do a particular behavior again in the future. Punishment is just the opposite. It is any outcome or consequence that weakens or lessens the probability of a response occurring in the future. So if we are more likely to repeat the behavior, we call it a reinforcer or reinforcement. And if it ends up weakening or lessening the occurrence, we would call it punishment. Okay, so that's our first axis. Are we increasing or decreasing the probability of a behavior? Next, we're going to look at positive and negative. And this is, again, where we have that preconceived notion that positive always goes with rewards and negative always goes with punishment. But again, not quite the same here. When we're talking about positive and negative, we're just talking about adding or removing a particular stimulus or event. So positive would be the addition of a stimulus or something as part of a consequence. Negative is the removal of something as part of a consequence. And so we can combine this positive and negative, and we can combine reinforcement and punishment into 4 separate options. So we have this on our next slide where we can break it down. So we're going to start with our first one, the one that we're probably most familiar with. This is the idea of positive reinforcement. So positive means that we're applying or adding a stimulus, and reinforcement means that adding that stimulus is going to increase the frequency of a desired behavior. So by adding something to the situation, we make it more likely for that behavior to occur again in the future. So this is rats in an operant box. They push the lever, they get food. They are more likely to push that lever again in the future. They get something, they receive food, so we've added a stimulus to the situation, and they press the lever more in the future. Perfect positive reinforcement. That's what we typically think of as a reward, but we would more prefer to call it a reinforcer because it's something that we're giving that is reinforcing that behavior. Okay, what about positive punishment? This is what people typically think of as punishment, but it's only one of our options for punishment. So we're going to apply a stimulus that decreases the frequency of an undesirable behavior. Okay, so maybe the rat presses the lever, but instead of getting food, maybe it turns the lights off. or maybe it plays a really loud sound. So they're doing something, so they're receiving something, so it's either darkness is coming in or a loud sound is being delivered, and it makes them less likely to do that behavior again in the future. They're less likely to press that lever in the future. We might also talk about sort of swearing in front of your parents. Being scolded would be an applied stimulus, and it would decrease the frequency of that behavior in the future, so that fits positive punishment too. Okay, so the positive side of things is okay, but it gets a little bit weird when we get into the negatives. So we're going to walk through these step by step as well. So negative, we're removing a stimulus. And for negative reinforcement, removing that stimulus will end up increasing the frequency of the desirable behavior. So imagine that you have a headache. So that's an aversive stimulus, pain in your head. If you take an Advil, you remove that pain. So we remove that aversive stimulus. That's probably going to make you more likely to take Advil in the future the next time you have a headache. So we could call that negative reinforcement because you've taken something that removes an aversive stimulus and you are now more likely to do it in the future. For negative punishment, we're removing a stimulus, but removing that stimulus decreases the frequency of a behavior. So maybe a child throws a toy and they're not supposed to throw the toy. So you take that toy away from them. So you've removed a stimulus, you removed the toy, and by not having the thing that they wanted to have, it might make the child less likely to do that bad behavior again in the future. So that is negative punishment because something has been taken away and they are less likely to act like that again in the future. So with these 4 possible options, it's a good idea to be able to tell the difference between each of these. And I like to break them down the way that I've done here. Are we adding or removing? Is it more or less likely? And the textbook always have some good examples of this, lots of different situations that might work. So I would recommend taking a look at those. But before we move on, I actually want to take our negative reinforcement and break that down just one step further. So we're going to talk about escape and avoidance behavior, both of which are based on the idea of negative reinforcement. So escape behavior is actually just textbook negative reinforcement, just like what we had talked about. So escape behavior is when you perform a behavior that terminates an aversive stimulus. So you took Advil so that you no longer have a headache. You stopped that aversive stimulus. That would be escape behavior because the aversive stimulus was present and you took something to get away from it. Avoidance behavior is just a little bit more complicated than that, and arguably cooler than that too. So avoidance behavior is when you perform a behavior that prevents an aversive stimulus from occurring in the first place. So instead of escaping when the stimulus is already present, you prevent it from occurring, so you avoid it altogether. So if we stick with our headache Advil example, maybe you know that you always have really bad headaches when a thunderstorm rolls through. And you know that in the afternoon there's going to be a thunderstorm. So you decide to take some preventative Advil so that you don't get a headache when the thunderstorm rolls through. We could say that you avoided developing a headache by acting in advance to prevent it from happening. That would be avoidance behavior. Typically, when we study avoidance and escape behavior, we use something that's called a shuttle box. It's almost like 2 operant chambers stuck together. So one of them would be the side that lets you know that a bad stimulus is coming, and then you can move to the other side to get away from it. And so at the beginning, when you start off, maybe what happens is that one side of the chamber is going to get really, really loud. So there's lots of static background noise and it's really aversive. You don't like being around loud noises. So at first, you don't know anything. We have to rely on escape behavior. So when that static comes on, it's really loud, so you're going to head to the other side of the enclosure. You're going to go into the other box, and you're going to get away from the sound. So you escaped from that bad situation. But over time, maybe you learn that right before the static starts, a red indicator turns on in that box. So a warning light, as it were, that says that static's coming. If you can classically condition an association where you learn that light always comes before the static, you might learn to react to that light the same way that you would to the static itself. So you now have advanced warning that the static is coming, so you can head to the other side of the enclosure before the static starts and avoid being present at all. So you learn that extra step and can avoid the situation. So escape behavior would be simple operant conditioning, but avoidance behavior also includes some classical conditioning because we have to learn something about the thing that tells us that the aversive stimulus is coming. And that's why avoidance behavior is just that little bit more complex and also cooler. So just a summary page here. We have our breakdown of all of our types of reinforcement and punishment, specifically with our negative reinforcement separated out into escape and avoidance as well. So this might be helpful to sort of organize what's going on for each of these. And then at the bottom, it also includes a couple of sort of base terms. So a useful diagram perhaps. And this is usually the point that we get to where we say, okay, so we have all of these different kinds of consequences. What is the best one to use? And the answer is that it depends. We can have lots of different reasons to use different kinds of setups, reinforcement versus punishment, depending on a situation. We can talk very generally as to what is typically preferred. And so I'm going to start by talking about the fact that we typically prefer to use reinforcement. Reinforcement just seems to work that little bit better. We'll spend some time on why we don't like punishment on the next slide, but they're going to go together pretty well. But with reinforcement, you are telling that individual or that organism that they've done the good behavior and you want them to do it more. Whether it's positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, it's sort of do more of this particular behavior. With punishment, you're saying don't do a bad behavior, but you don't actually give them an alternative to direct themselves towards. So that's sort of ambiguous, and one of the reasons why reinforcement is going to be preferred. Reinforcement also has this interesting factor where you don't need reinforcement every single time for it to be effective. And we'll actually find out later on in this chapter that intermittent reinforcement can actually be very, very helpful. So if a child is, you're encouraging them to get along with their sibling and you see them playing nicely and nothing bad is going on. So you go over and you tell them both that they're doing a great job. You don't have to do that every single time you see them together not hurting each other, but every once in a while, and you will see more and more of that behavior happen. So with this reinforcement, you get more of that desirable behavior and you don't have to constantly monitor to catch it every single time it happens. We also have sort of the ethical side of things where reinforcement is typically improving a situation because we're getting good things or removing bad things. So it's usually better that way. So it's not unethical to use reinforcement. So this should give you some idea as to why we don't like punishment. So we start off with the first one, that's punishment on its own only tells us what not to do. It doesn't tell us what we should be doing instead. So if you wanted punishment to be effective, you almost always have to pair it with reinforcement anyways. So sometimes you're better off just using reinforcement. Punishment also, again, involves aversive stimuli. Sometimes, especially with positive punishment, you run into things that might cause pain or discomfort, which ethically should be avoided as much as possible. We also run into issues where not just for the individual who's on the receiving end, but the person who delivers punishment, there's an interesting setup. So if you think of, say, a parent who's yelling at their child, so they're using positive punishment on a child, but the outcome of the parent doing this is that the child then sort of changes their behavior. So yelling becomes reinforcing for the parent because they're now more likely to yell in the future because it got them the outcome that they wanted. So while they're using punishment, the outcome of that becomes reinforcing for them and they become more likely to use it. And you can see that they use it more and more often and sometimes with increasing effect. So they will sort of spiral out of control, which can be problematic. And those who receive punishment then also see it as an option to use to get other people to do things they want them to do. So if a child is yelled at home, they're more likely to yell at their friends to get things because that's what they've experienced. So that can be problematic. And then even just on the effectiveness side of things, where I mentioned before, reinforcement doesn't require every single occurrence of the behavior to be reinforced. For punishment to be effective, you need to punish immediately, every single time that bad behavior happens, and with an aversive stimulus that is large enough or intense enough that it will deter that behavior occurring again in the future. Basically, it's just not as efficient to use punishment. So it's not ethical, it has side effects, and it's not as efficient. So those are a bunch of reasons why we typically shy away from punishment and tend to prefer reinforcement, just as a sort of explanation in general. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about for today are two sort of related concepts, and these are shaping and chaining. So I started off by talking about rats pressing levers or pigeons pecking keys, but those aren't natural behaviors. Those aren't things that a rat or a pigeon is just going to do on their own. So how do we get them to start doing those actions? How do we get that to occur? And the answer is the process of shaping. So shaping just involves reinforcing successive approximations towards a final response. So if you want a rat to press a lever, you're going to start with baby steps. So maybe at first, you're going to give the rat food anytime they face the lever. So if they're facing in the right direction, you're going to give them food. They are reinforced for being kind of close to the behavior that you want. Once they reliably face towards the lever, you would stop giving them food just for facing the lever. And maybe now you're going to give them food if they approach the lever. So that's even closer. That's another step closer to pressing a lever. Okay, now that they approach pretty consistently, you're only going to give them food if they touch the lever. Okay, they touch it, now only if they press it. So you've reinforced each of those successive approximations, each of those baby steps towards that desirable outcome. And specifically, you're no longer reinforcing those previous approximations. So we have some differential reinforcement where we're nudging them in the direction of the behavior that we want, and we're nudging them away from the behaviors that we don't want anymore. So we're giving them reinforcement for what we're aiming for, and then we stop reinforcing the other stuff. And so this is how we can get some pretty complex behaviors. And I'll give you guys the example of teaching our chickadees how to use a feeder that has sensors to give them food when they do stuff that they're supposed to. So that's getting them to do the basic behavior. Next, we can talk about the idea of chaining. And so chaining is when we actually have sort of existing responses, behaviors that they would do, but we would reinforce each response not with sort of a primary reinforcer like food, but specifically with the opportunity to do the next step in that behavior. So we would chain together or string together multiple behaviors. So we see this a lot in training animals. So if you have a pet and you've trained them to do some complex behaviors, it's usually done through chaining. So a great example of this, people who have rats are really good at chained behaviors. But there's a video where a rat has a ladder and he wants to go and get food. But to get the food, he has to take the ladder up a platform. And then once he's gotten it to that platform, he has to take it up to another platform. And then he has to use the ladder to get across a gap to get the food. So each step isn't directly reinforced, but you have to do the first step to be able to do the second step, to be able to do the third step to get the food. So you get reinforcement from each individual step because it eventually gets you to that final reinforcement of food. So you get to develop these more complex sequences of behaviors through the process of chaining. Okay. And so the next concepts are a little bit more intensive. We're going to talk about extinction and generalization and discrimination as it applies to operant conditioning. But I think I'm going to leave us there for today, and we'll pick up there on Wednesday. So we will start with that next time.